Winter arrived earlier than anyone expected that year. For 3 straight days, heavy snow covered every mountain trail, every pine tree, and every wooden rooftop in the small countryside village of Black Pine Valley. The winding roads disappeared beneath thick blankets of white, and the forest became quieter than ever before. My name is Ethan, and for more than 25 years I had lived alone in a small wooden cabin deep in the mountains. Most people in the village knew me as a carpenter, while others knew me as the man who rescued injured wildlife whenever harsh winters pushed animals dangerously close to human homes. Living alone never bothered me. Every morning I split firewood, repaired furniture for nearby families, and delivered supplies to elderly neighbors whose homes were buried beneath the snow. The forest had always been my closest companion. That morning, after the storm had finally passed, the sky was crystal blue and sunlight sparkled across the frozen landscape. I loaded my sled with tools and walked into the forest to inspect fallen trees that might block the mountain trail. Fresh animal tracks crossed the snow. Deer, foxes, rabbits. Then I noticed something different. Large paw prints, wolf tracks. I stopped walking immediately. A pack had passed through only a few hours earlier. Wolves had lived in these mountains long before people arrived, and they almost never came close to humans unless something was terribly wrong. Curiosity pulled me forward, and I carefully followed the tracks for several hundred meters until they suddenly scattered in every direction. The snow around them was stained with blood. Broken branches littered the ground, and deep claw marks scarred the frozen earth. A struggle had taken place. Then I heard it. A tiny whimper, so faint that it was almost swallowed by the wind moving through the pine trees. I climbed over a fallen pine trunk and looked beneath its tangled roots. Two bright blue eyes stared back at me. Hidden in the hollow was a tiny wolf pup no more than 8 weeks old. His thick grey fur was soaked with melting snow. One of his front legs was trapped beneath a heavy branch, and his entire body trembled uncontrollably from the freezing cold. Even in his terrible condition, he still tried to growl. It sounded more like the frightened cry of a puppy than the warning of a wild wolf. I knelt slowly and spoke as gently as I could. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The little wolf showed his tiny teeth anyway. Fear was the only thing keeping him alive. I carefully lifted the branch and freed his injured leg. He cried softly, tried to stand, and immediately collapsed into the snow. He had no strength left. I looked around the clearing and saw fresh tracks from several adult wolves. They had been here recently, but now they were gone. Then I noticed something lying beneath the snow a few meters away. It was a large grey she-wolf. Half of her body was pinned beneath the fallen tree. Fresh blood stained the white snow around her. The storm had brought the giant pine crashing down, and she had died protecting her pup. For a long moment, neither the little wolf nor I moved. The only sound was the cold wind whispering through the trees. I slowly removed my wool scarf, wrapped it around the trembling pup, and lifted him into my arms. He struggled weakly for only a few seconds before giving up. His frightened blue eyes never left mine. Then, very slowly, he rested his tiny head against my arm. Perhaps he realized he no longer had the strength to fight. Or perhaps, for the first time since losing his mother, he simply felt warmth again. I tucked him safely beneath my heavy winter coat and began the long walk back to my cabin. The journey through the deep snow lasted nearly 2 hours. Every few minutes I stopped to make sure he was still breathing. His heartbeat was unbelievably weak, but it was still there. When I finally reached home, my old golden retriever Bailey came running out to greet me. She barked excitedly until she caught the scent of the little wolf hidden beneath my coat. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of growling or backing away, Bailey quietly walked closer, gently sniffed the frightened pup, and softly licked the snow from his face. The tiny wolf watched her with nervous eyes but didn't try to bite. Inside the cabin, I placed him on a blanket beside the fireplace, where the warmth slowly filled the room. I heated fresh goat's milk and carefully fed him through a small bottle. At first he refused, but hunger soon became stronger than fear. He drank every last drop. When he finished, he looked at me with exhausted blue eyes. And for the very first time since I had found him, the frightened growl disappeared completely. That night the temperature outside fell below 20 degrees below zero. and the wind howled across the mountains like a lonely song. Inside the warm cabin, Bailey curled around the tiny wolf as though he were her own puppy, keeping him safe through the freezing night. Before blowing out the lantern, I looked at the little bundle of grey fur sleeping peacefully beside the fire and quietly whispered, "You've survived the storm. From today on, you'll never face another winter alone." Outside, the moon rose above the silent forest, and somewhere far beyond the snowy mountains, a lone wolf howled into the frozen darkness. I had no idea that rescuing one frightened wolf pup on that winter morning would begin a friendship that neither time, distance, nor the wilderness would ever be able to break. The little wolf slept for almost 2 full days without waking except when I gently fed him warm goat's milk beside the fireplace. His injured front leg had been cleaned, wrapped carefully in fresh bandages, and supported with 2 small cedar splints. The village veterinarian traveled nearly 15 kilometers through deep snow just to examine him. After checking his heartbeat and gently feeling his injured leg, she smiled with relief. "He's lucky," she said. "The bone isn't broken. With enough rest, he'll make a full recovery." Before leaving, she looked at me and quietly added, "Most people would have left a wolf in the forest." I glanced toward the sleeping pup curled tightly inside Bailey's blanket and answered softly, "He didn't choose to be born into a storm." During the following week, the little wolf barely moved. He watched every sound inside the cabin with cautious blue eyes. Whenever I reached toward him too quickly, he flinched. Whenever the fire crackled loudly, he hid behind Bailey. Fear had become part of him, not because he was wild, but because he had lost everything he had ever known. Bailey slowly became his first true friend. The old golden retriever treated him as if he were her own puppy, cleaning his fur every morning, sharing her warm blanket every night, and patiently ignoring his frightened growls whenever he became nervous. Day after day, those growls became quieter until they disappeared altogether. One cold afternoon, while I sat beside the fireplace carving a wooden spoon, the finished spoon slipped from my hands and rolled across the floor. Before I could stand, the little wolf limped after it, carefully picked it up with his mouth, and gently placed it beside my boot. I couldn't help laughing. "Thank you," I whispered. His ears twitched, and for the first time, the tip of his tiny tail gave the smallest wag imaginable. As the days passed, his playful personality slowly began to appear. He chased snowflakes drifting past the cabin windows, barked proudly at squirrels hiding in the pine trees, and tried his best to copy Bailey whenever she fetched sticks. Most of the time he failed in the funniest ways. Instead of bringing the stick back, he buried it somewhere beneath the snow, then spent several minutes trying to remember where he had hidden it. Every mistake seemed to surprise him more than anyone else. One bright winter morning, while clearing snow from the front porch, I noticed a second set of tiny paw prints beside my own footprints. The little wolf insisted on helping. Every time I pushed snow away from the steps, he ran behind me, kicking half of it right back where I had just cleared. The job took twice as long, but I laughed the entire morning. News of the rescued wolf soon spread through Black Pine Valley. Some villagers were curious, while others worried about allowing a wolf to live so close to people. One evening, several neighbors visited my cabin to see him with their own eyes. They stood quietly near the fireplace, watching the little wolf resting beside Bailey. One man finally asked, "Can a wolf really live peacefully with people?" I smiled and answered honestly, "I don't know, but kindness has never harmed anyone." As if he understood the conversation, the little wolf slowly walked toward the visitors. Everyone became nervous. Instead of growling, he gently rested his head against the hand of the oldest woman in the group. She smiled warmly, scratched behind his ears, and whispered, "He still has the heart of a frightened child." From that evening onward, the villagers began seeing him differently. When spring finally arrived, the deep snow slowly melted into rushing streams. Wildflowers covered the forest floor, and the little wolf's injured leg healed beautifully. One warm morning, I opened the cabin door and let him step outside without worry for the very first time. He stood perfectly still, breathing in the fresh scent of pine trees, damp earth, and the endless wilderness stretching across the mountains. Freedom stood only a few steps away. For several long moments he gazed toward the forest where he had been born. Then, without hesitation, He turned around, walked calmly back inside the cabin, and curled up beside Bailey's bed. At that moment, I realized something important. The forest would always be part of him, but home had become something entirely different. That evening we sat together on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the snowy peaks. As the cool mountain breeze whispered through the valley, I realized the little wolf still had no name. I looked into his bright blue eyes and smiled. What should I call you? The wind gently swept through the pine trees, carrying a soft whisper across the hillside. Suddenly a name came to my mind. Kale. I spoke it aloud. The little wolf immediately lifted his ears and looked directly at me. Kale, I repeated with a smile. His tail began wagging happily. I laughed. I guess you like it. From that day on, whenever I called his name, he came running without hesitation. Kale followed me everywhere. He accompanied me into the forest to gather firewood, walked beside me to the village while I delivered handmade furniture, and even carried the smallest logs he could find whenever I chopped wood. If I searched for mushrooms, Kale searched beside me, although he usually became distracted by butterflies dancing through the sunlight. As summer arrived, the mountains turned a deep shade of green, and Kale grew into a magnificent young wolf. His silver-gray coat shimmered beneath the warm sun, and his once frightened blue eyes now shone with confidence and quiet intelligence. Yet despite becoming stronger every day, he never forgot what it meant to be vulnerable. Whenever Bailey grew tired during our long walks, Kale slowed his pace to match hers. When storms knocked young birds from their nests, he carefully guarded them until I arrived to help. Even the wild deer that grazed near the cabin no longer fled in panic whenever he appeared. Somehow the forest itself seemed to understand that this wolf carried no cruelty in his heart. One peaceful evening, we stood together on a rocky hill overlooking the valley as the setting sun painted the sky with brilliant shades of orange and crimson. I rested my hand gently on Kale's shoulder and quietly said, "You've become exactly what your mother hoped you would be. Strong enough to survive, gentle enough to protect, and loyal enough to become my greatest friend." Kale stepped closer and rested his head against my shoulder. We stood together in complete silence while the first stars appeared above the mountains. Far below us, the lights of Black Pine Valley slowly flickered to life one by one. In that quiet moment, life felt perfect. Neither of us could possibly know that beyond the western mountains, a terrible danger was already approaching. One that would soon test the courage of every person in the valley and reveal just how far one loyal wolf was willing to go to protect the people he loved. Summer slowly faded into autumn, and the mountains surrounding Black Pine Valley transformed into endless waves of crimson, orange, and golden leaves. Every morning a cool mist drifted through the valleys, carrying the fresh scent of pine and damp earth. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm once again. Kale and I spent our days repairing fences, gathering firewood for the coming winter, and delivering handmade furniture to families throughout the village. Bailey had grown old, her muzzle now almost completely white, and she no longer ran across the fields as she once had. Without anyone asking, Kale naturally slowed his pace whenever she became tired, staying close beside her as if protecting the friend who had once protected him. The villagers had completely accepted Kale as one of their own. Children laughed whenever they saw the great grey wolf carrying small bundles of firewood behind me, and they eagerly scratched behind his ears before running off to play. Even the village mayor often smiled and joked. "I've met many people less trustworthy than that wolf." Everyone laughed because everyone knew it was true. One cool October afternoon, while cutting fallen branches near the western edge of the forest, something suddenly felt wrong. The birds had stopped singing. The squirrels had disappeared into the trees. Even the insects had fallen strangely silent. Kale immediately lifted his head, his ears standing perfectly straight as he sniffed the wind. A deep, uneasy growl escaped from his throat. It wasn't directed at me. It was directed toward the forest itself. A moment later I smelled it too. Smoke. At first it was only a faint scent carried by the breeze, but within seconds it became stronger. I climbed onto a large boulder overlooking the valley and saw a thin column of grey smoke rising beyond the western ridge. Then another appeared, and another. Within minutes the entire horizon darkened beneath thick clouds of smoke. The wind shifted suddenly, driving the fire toward the valley with frightening speed. I dropped my tools and ran toward the village as fast as I could. Fire! I shouted. The forest is burning. Church bells echoed across Black Pine Valley as villagers rushed from their homes carrying buckets, shovels, and water barrels. Volunteer firefighters loaded hoses onto old trucks while families hurried to move livestock away from the approaching flames. But the mountain wind was relentless. Dry leaves ignited within seconds. Towering pine trees burst into flames like giant torches, and black ash drifted through the sky like snow. Wild animals fled in every direction. Deer raced across the fields. Foxes disappeared into the hills, and frightened birds filled the smoky sky. Kale watched them quietly without chasing any of them. He simply stood beside me, staring silently as the forest that had once been his home disappeared beneath the advancing fire. By late afternoon, the flames had reached the northern ridge, and only one narrow mountain road remained open. News arrived that an elderly couple and their young grandson were trapped inside a remote cabin beyond the burning forest. Fallen trees blocked every rescue vehicle, and the firefighters could not reach them in time. As everyone desperately searched for another route, Kale suddenly barked. He wasn't looking toward the fire but toward an old hunting trail that had been abandoned for years. He barked again, then began running several meters before stopping and looking back at me, as if asking me to follow him. Without hesitation, I trusted him. Grabbing only my backpack, I followed Kale into the dense forest. The forgotten trail was barely visible beneath fallen leaves and broken branches. Yet Kale moved with complete confidence. Thick smoke burned my lungs, and several times I nearly lost sight of him. But whenever I slowed, he stopped patiently until I caught up. After nearly an hour of climbing through smoke and heat, faint cries for help reached our ears. Hidden behind a wall of burning trees stood the small cabin. The elderly couple and the frightened little boy were trapped inside, completely surrounded by flames. Their only bridge across a rushing stream had already collapsed, leaving them with nowhere to escape. The old man saw us through the smoke and cried out my name. I searched desperately for another way across, but every path was blocked. Then, before I could think of a solution, Kale sprinted uphill and disappeared into the smoke. I shouted after him, but he never looked back. Seconds later, a deafening crack echoed through the mountains. High above us, an enormous dead pine tree began to fall. The giant trunk crashed perfectly across the stream, creating a natural bridge while also clearing away several burning bushes that blocked the escape route. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Kale had deliberately pushed against the weakened tree until it finally collapsed. Quickly, I shouted. One by one, the family crossed the fallen trunk while I helped them keep their balance. Just as the grandmother reached safety, a massive burning branch crashed directly across the bridge, cutting off the escape route. Without hesitation, Kale leaped forward. Ignoring the blazing heat, he threw his full weight against the burning branch. Flames scorched the fur along his shoulder, and he cried out in pain. Yet he never stopped pushing until the branch rolled aside. The path reopened just long enough for the family to escape. Only seconds later, the burning bridge collapsed into the rushing stream behind us. We barely reached the village before nightfall. Exhausted firefighters cheered when they saw the rescued family alive. The little boy ran straight toward Kale, wrapped both arms around the great wolf's neck, and whispered through tears, "You saved us." Kale gently licked the child's forehead before quietly lying down from exhaustion. The village veterinarian immediately treated the burns on his shoulder, assuring everyone that although the injuries were painful, he would recover completely. I stayed beside him throughout the entire night, changing cool bandages and gently stroking his fur as he rested his head against my knee, just as he had done when he was only a frightened little wolf pup. Looking into his calm blue eyes, I smiled and whispered, "You protected everyone today, just as your mother once protected you." Outside, the distant mountains still glowed red beneath the wildfire, but inside the warmth of the little wooden cabin, hope remained alive. None of us realized that an even greater challenge awaited beyond the coming winter. One that would place my own life in danger and prove beyond all doubt that the bond between a man and a rescued wolf could become stronger than fear, stronger than nature, and even stronger than time itself. Winter returned to Black Pine Valley with a breathtaking beauty that concealed its dangers beneath a blanket of white. Thick snow covered every mountain trail, every pine tree, and every wooden rooftop until the entire valley seemed frozen in time. The forest became strangely quiet, and the oldest hunters often said that when the mountains fell this silent, they were listening, waiting for something to happen. By then, Kale had grown into a magnificent wolf. His silver-grey coat blended perfectly with the snowy landscape, and his sharp blue eyes noticed the smallest movement long before any human could. Whenever we explored the mountains together, I rarely carried a compass anymore. If Kale chose a different trail, I trusted him completely because his instincts had already saved my life more than once. Bailey had become very old. Her muzzle was almost entirely white, and she spent most afternoons sleeping peacefully beside the fireplace. Even so, Kale never wandered far from her. Every evening before coming inside, he gently nudged her shoulder with his nose as if checking that she was comfortable. And only after she looked up at him would he quietly lie down nearby. Their friendship had never faded with time. One freezing morning before sunrise, the village mayor knocked urgently on my cabin door. His expression told me something was terribly wrong. A young couple and their little daughter who lived in a remote cabin high in the eastern mountains had not been seen for 3 days. Heavy snowfall had buried every road leading to their home. No smoke rose from their chimney. No footprints surrounded the cabin. And no one had been able to reach them. Within an hour, a rescue team was assembled, including 2 mountain rangers, 3 experienced climbers, the village doctor, and me. Naturally, Kale refused to stay behind. The mayor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. By then, everyone in Black Pine Valley trusted the great wolf as much as any member of the rescue team. We began climbing through knee-deep snow while freezing winds swept across the mountains. Progress was painfully slow as fallen trees blocked the narrow trails and thick ice covered the rocks beneath our boots. Kale walked several meters ahead, occasionally stopping to glance back and make sure every member of the team was still following. Hours passed before we reached the steepest section of the mountain. Suddenly, Kale froze. His ears lifted, his body became tense, and he sniffed the icy wind. A deep growl escaped his throat. I stopped immediately and looked around. But at first I heard nothing. Then a faint cracking sound echoed high above us. It was almost too quiet to notice, like distant thunder rolling beneath the snow. One of the climbers turned pale. He looked toward the cliffs towering above us and whispered only one word: avalanche. Before anyone could react, the mountainside began to move. At first it was only a gentle slide, but within seconds thousands of tons of snow thundered down the slope with terrifying force. Trees snapped like twigs, giant boulders tumbled through the white wave, and the roar of the avalanche swallowed every other sound. We ran desperately toward a cluster of massive rocks, the only shelter within reach. As I counted the members of the rescue team, my heart sank. The youngest ranger, Lucas, had fallen behind while carrying medical supplies. He stood frozen in the open, unable to move as the wall of snow raced toward him. Without hesitation, Kale exploded into motion. Before anyone could stop him, he sprinted directly toward Lucas with astonishing speed. I shouted his name, but he never slowed down, reaching the terrified young ranger only seconds before the avalanche arrived. Kale threw the full weight of his body against Lucas, knocking him sideways behind a giant granite boulder. An instant later, the avalanche crashed over the trail, burying everything beneath an ocean of snow. When the roaring finally stopped, an eerie silence settled across the mountains. We searched frantically, digging through the snow with our hands despite the freezing cold. Every second felt like an hour. Then one of the rangers shouted. A patch of silver-grey fur appeared beneath the snow. We dug faster until Kale's body finally emerged. He was unconscious, his breathing painfully shallow, and his body was almost frozen. The village doctor immediately wrapped him in thick blankets and checked his heartbeat. It was weak, but it was still there. Lucas knelt beside Kale with tears streaming down his face. He saved my life, he whispered over and over again. He pushed me out of the way. The rescue mission ended immediately. Nothing mattered more than bringing Kale home alive. We built a sled from pine branches and carefully carried him down the mountain through deep snow. The journey lasted nearly 6 exhausting hours, and I never left his side. Every few minutes I gently called his name. begging him to keep fighting. At last we reached the warmth of the cabin. Bailey slowly approached, despite her age and aching joints, and lay beside Kale exactly as she had years earlier when he was only a frightened orphan. She rested her head gently across his paws as if reminding him that he was still surrounded by family. For 3 long days, Kale never opened his eyes. The veterinarian visited every morning while villagers brought food, medicine, and firewood without being asked. Children left handwritten notes outside my cabin. And one simple message touched me more than anything else. It read, "Please get better, Kale. The mountains still need their guardian." I barely slept during those 3 days. I sat beside him through every hour of the night, holding one of his paws and quietly telling him stories about our adventures together, hoping that somehow he could still hear my voice. Then, just after sunrise on the 4th morning, I felt something. Kale's paw gently squeezed my hand. Slowly, his beautiful blue eyes opened once again. They were tired and weak, but they were alive. Relief flooded through me as tears filled my eyes. I smiled, gently stroked his head, and whispered, "You stubborn old wolf, you kept your promise." Kale looked at me for several silent seconds before slowly lifting his head and resting it against my shoulder. Outside, church bells echoed across Black Pine Valley as word spread that the wolf everyone loved had survived. The entire village celebrated, believing the hardest days were finally behind us. None of us knew that life was quietly preparing one final test. Not one of fire or snow, but one that would ask the greatest question of all. Could a friendship remain just as strong when time itself began taking away the people we loved most? The years slipped quietly by, and before either of us truly realized it, both Kale and I had grown old together. The forests of Black Pine Valley continued to change with every passing season. Spring covered the mountains with colorful wildflowers. Summer filled the valleys with birdsong. Autumn painted the hills with brilliant shades of gold and crimson. And winter wrapped the entire landscape in peaceful silence beneath deep snow. Through every season, one thing never changed. Kale was always beside me. I was no longer the strong carpenter who could carry heavy logs across the mountains with ease. My beard had turned completely white. My hands trembled slightly whenever I carved wood. And climbing the steep forest trails left me breathless. Bailey had passed away peacefully one warm spring morning beside the fireplace where she had spent so many happy years. We buried her beneath the old pine tree behind the cabin. And Kale remained there until sunset, refusing to leave her side. From that day forward, every time we walked past that tree, he stopped quietly for a few moments as if greeting an old friend who was still somehow watching over us. Kale had changed too. The powerful young wolf who once raced effortlessly across the mountains now moved with slower, more careful steps. The old injury from the avalanche sometimes caused him to limp during the coldest mornings. And silver fur had begun to appear around his muzzle. Yet whenever I looked into his bright blue eyes, I still saw the frightened little wolf pup I had rescued beneath the fallen pine tree all those years before. One snowy evening, while the wind whispered outside the cabin, I sat beside the fireplace carving one final wooden figure. My hands were slower than they had once been, but every careful cut carried years of memories. When the carving was finished, it looked exactly like Kale. I smiled, placed the little wooden wolf beside him, and quietly said, "I've carved hundreds of things during my lifetime, but this one belongs only to you." Kale gently picked up the carving in his mouth, examined it for a long moment, and carefully placed it beside his favorite sleeping place. From that day on, no one was allowed to move it. As winter deepened, my health slowly began to fail. At first it was only a stubborn cough. Then came the fever, followed by long days when even walking across the cabin became difficult. The village doctor visited almost every morning. She urged me to stop working, to rest, and to let the younger villagers take care of the heavy tasks. But I only smiled and told her I had never been very good at sitting still. Kale understood the truth long before I admitted it to myself. He rarely left my side. If I rested in my chair, he lay at my feet. If I stepped outside, he followed so closely that his shoulder brushed gently against my leg. It was as though he knew that every moment together had become precious. The people of Black Pine Valley noticed the changes as well. Every morning someone quietly left fresh bread, vegetables, or warm soup outside my door. Every evening another neighbor stopped by to make sure I was comfortable. Looking around at the kindness surrounding me, I realized that compassion always finds its way home. Years ago, I had chosen to save one frightened wolf pup. Without realizing it, that single act of kindness had returned to me through an entire community. One crisp winter morning, feeling that my strength was fading, I wrapped myself in a thick wool blanket and slowly climbed the small hill behind the cabin with Kale walking faithfully beside me. It was the very place where I had first given him his name many years before. Together we sat overlooking the valley as soft sunlight spread across the snow-covered mountains. For a long time, neither of us moved. The cold wind drifted gently through the pine trees while an eagle circled high above the valley. Finally, I rested my hand upon Kale's head and smiled. "Do you remember the day we met?" I whispered. "You were so small, so frightened, and so determined to survive. I always believed I was the one who saved you. But the truth is you saved me too. You gave a lonely old man a family." Kale slowly rested his head upon my lap exactly as he had done countless times throughout our lives together. I gently scratched behind his ears before speaking once more. "If one day you wake up and I'm no longer here, don't spend your life waiting for me. Keep living, keep protecting these mountains. And every winter, when the first snow begins to fall, remember that somewhere, somehow, I'll still be walking beside you." A tear slowly rolled down my cheek. Without hesitation, Kale gently licked it away, just as he had done every time sadness visited me over the years. That night the snow fell softly outside the cabin while the fire crackled warmly inside. I sat peacefully in my favorite wooden chair wrapped in Bailey's old blanket. And Kale lay quietly at my feet with the little wooden wolf beside him. Sometime before dawn, my breathing became slower, softer, and finally came to a peaceful stop. There was no pain, no fear, only silence and the comforting presence of my oldest friend beside me. When the villagers arrived the following morning, they found Kale exactly where he had always been. His head rested gently against my hand. He refused to move when they called his name, and he remained there until they carefully carried my body from the cabin. The entire valley gathered for my funeral. Mountain rangers, firefighters, the family Kale had rescued from the wildfire, Lucas whose life had been saved during the avalanche, children who had grown up believing every village should have a guardian wolf, and countless neighbors stood together beneath the falling snow to say goodbye. As the ceremony ended, Kale slowly approached my grave carrying something carefully in his mouth. It was the little wooden wolf I had carved during my final winter. He gently placed it beside the flowers, lay down quietly in the snow, and watched until the sun disappeared beyond the mountains. From that day forward, the people of Black Pine Valley often saw a lone grey wolf sitting outside the old wooden cabin or resting beneath the pine tree where Bailey slept. Every winter morning, fresh wolf tracks appeared around my grave before anyone else reached the cemetery. No one disturbed them because everyone understood what they meant. Love does not disappear when someone is gone. Sometimes it simply learns how to wait. Years later, when Kale himself grew old, the villagers found him peacefully lying beside my grave beneath a blanket of fresh snow. As though he had finally completed the promise he made on the day I carried him home through the storm. They buried him beside me under the old pine tree, placing a simple wooden plaque between our graves. It read, "Ethan and Kale, a man and a wolf who proved that true friendship is not measured by words, blood, or species, but by loyalty, compassion, and a love that even time could never erase." Even today, when winter returns to Black Pine Valley and the first snow begins to fall, parents bring their children to the old cabin and tell them the story of the lonely carpenter and the orphaned wolf. Some call it a legend, others call it a miracle, but those who truly understand simply smile, because they know the greatest miracles are often born from a single act of kindness shared between two hearts that chose to trust one another.